mother often said to me, get married, boy, and see how happy you will be. I have looked all over, but no girlie can I find who seems to be just like the little girl I have in mind. I will have to look around until the right one I have found. I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old Dad.
I love horror games. Horror games have always been something that has been within my general gameplay list for as long as I can remember, and the reason for that is because a lot of them stuck with me. It could be for any reason, from the gameplay that drops me into the shoes of a character who is super weak and also dumb enough to not try finding a weapon to crack it over the head of whatever goon is trying to turn me into a pelt, to forcing me to make choices that can mean life or death, either for me or whatever friend I'm with, only for said friend to criticize me anyway, prompting me to reload a previous save, let them die, and move on with my life, because I don't need these toxic personalities dragging me down. I remember one of the first games to ever truly scare me was a game known as Fate, which isn't a horror game, but rather a dungeon crawler that was really dark, and said dungeons were full of creatures that my 7-year-old brain had no idea how to comprehend. As such, I never made it past the first dungeon before my fear overwhelmed me, and to this day, I haven't gone back to it. Mainly because I don't care to revisit it. I don't know, dungeon crawlers aren't really my thing. Regardless, from that day forth, there's been plenty of games that have scared me, even ones that aren't related to horror in general. However, one that has constantly stuck with me, even to this day, is the very first Outlast. Outlast is a franchise that I've grown very attached to as the years went by. I played the first game and I of course loved it. I played the second game and I didn't love it. Then I played Trials and I liked it. If you can't tell, I have an obvious favorite, and no, it's not the one where you get crucified. The first Outlast is one of my favorite games of all time. I love the atmosphere, the heart-pounding chases, how it still manages to take me by surprise all these years later, and with Red Barrel celebrating its anniversary recently, that means it's as good a time as any to talk about the game, in particular one of the characters. Now, since Outlast is something I haven't talked about on this channel before, I'm going to do my best to sum up the game's general plot. For anyone who's interested in playing the game, feel free to skip to around this part of the video if you'd rather not be spoiled. If you're still around and don't mind being spoiled, well, here you go. Outlast's story sees you be put in the shoes of investigative reporter Miles Upshur, who had received an email exposing the horrific actions of the Murkoff Corporation and was tasked with exploring Mount Massive Asylum. Unfortunately, Miles' arrival had correlated with an incident that resulted in the asylum falling into chaos. In order to escape, Miles must run, hide, and survive against some of the lowest forms of humanity the asylum has to offer. In addition to the main story, Outlast has a DLC known as Whistleblower, putting you in the shoes of Waylon Park, the man who sent the email in the first place. Taking place around the same time as the events of the main game, Waylon has much of the same goal as Miles, to get out alive and avoid being maimed by the various residents within the asylum. Among the various faces you'll encounter in the game is Richard Trager, a former Murkoff employee who had used his position to lure women out on dates before spiking their drinks and sexually assaulting them. After his actions were exposed and he attempted to murder the woman he had previously assaulted, Trager was committed into the asylum and placed into the morphogenic engine. Post-incident, Trager used the chaos as an opportunity to maim, torture, and kill various staff members and inmates, all under the veneer of a pleasant, charismatic surgeon. Another face that will be found is Chris Walker, a hulking brute of a man who pops up throughout the game. Like Trager before him, Walker was also a Murkoff employee, one whose psyche was unstable due to PTSD from the war in Afghanistan. After he snapped and murdered 5 inmates, Walker would meet a similar fate to Trager, being forcefully committed into the asylum and placed into the engine. Unlike Trager, however, who used the massacre as an opportunity to indulge in sadistic torture, Walker would go around and brutally murder several individuals, whether it be staff, security, or even fellow inmates, in order to prevent the Wall Rider, an entity that Murkoff was attempting to control, from finding a host. It's a definitely more understandable and, dare I say, sympathetic motivation compared to Trager, at least until Chris decides to reenact that one vine and say to Miles,
"So no head?"
There's other faces encountered like Father Martin, a priest who's ostensibly the only ally Miles has throughout the game, the twins, 2 of Martin's followers who are best known for being naked, the Wall Rider, the aforementioned entity that Chris is trying to contain that sounds like a Tony Hawk trick, and Frank Manera, a cannibal who wants to, as the alias implies, eat you, something he could probably do as soon as he gets his AI fixed. These are just the main examples of the deranged, broken, outright insane people you'll encounter in this game. However, as memorable as these characters are, there is one that many fans remember, even more than Trager and Walker. It is a man that many who have played this game get chills upon the mention of him. A man whose mere image struck fear into the hearts of many, stripped away all the comforts many would usually have in a horror game, and in turn became perhaps the most memorable and frightening character in the entire franchise. That man is Eddie Gluskin. I think before we get into Gluskin's role during the game, we should talk about his background, mainly because it's a unique kind of backstory compared to every named character here, and does help contextualize why Eddie is not only the way he is, but also what makes him such a chilling character. Not much is known about Gluskin's early life, save for the fact he was a victim of severe sexual abuse at the hands of his father and uncle, with them going as far as to take photos of the abuse. Not helping matters is that, through dialogue, it's implied that Eddie's mother not only knew about the abuse, but also refused to do anything about it. While his father and uncle were eventually incarcerated, Eddie was already broken entirely. With all the trauma he had been put through, Eddie would eventually become a misogynistic serial killer, murdering 3 women before being committed to the asylum. Most likely, Eddie's choice of targeting women stemmed from his abuse, in particular the lack of action taken by his mother. Actually, speaking of which, there's actually a line that might have been cut, or is very rare to hear, that reveals that Eddie has a younger sister.
How could you touch your little sister like that?
From the way he says this line with a much higher pitch of tone, it can imply that Eddie mimicked what was done to him with his younger sister, only for his mother to catch and berate him. This line adds way more context to his choice in victim and the way he is, and it isn't just that his mother didn't do anything to stop his abuse, but also blamed him for what he did to his sister when he didn't even know it was wrong. While in the quote-unquote care of the asylum, Eddie would receive several patient consultations, although one can only be found in the game. While the reasoning for the consultations was presumably to gauge what made Eddie tick most once put into the chamber, it does reveal a lot about him. For starters, it's revealed that the repeated trauma that occurred in Eddie's childhood resulted in Eddie developing a coping mechanism where he insisted he grew up in a Leave It to Beaver-esque household despite his abuse being public record. Upon being confronted with foes of the abuse, Eddie became violent to the extent of needing restraints. Additionally, Eddie refuses to acknowledge that the women he murdered were dead or mutilated, even when confronted with photographic evidence. While it is heavily possible that the photos of his victims were taken by police, I personally believe it's just as likely that Eddie took the photos himself, as it would tie back into the chain of harm that Eddie seems to perpetrate, not willing to acknowledge that what his father and uncle did was wrong, all while carrying on their vile ways as mentioned earlier with his sister. Plus, it would tie into his actions that would be seen later on in the game. You'll likely notice that even before getting into the game, one of Eddie's major traits is how much he denies reality. He denies the reality of what his father and uncle did to him. He denies what he did to his murder victims, refusing to admit that they were dead. He's living within his own fantasy, and any attempts to bring him out of that fantasy result in violence, all stemming from his steadfast refusal to acknowledge he was wronged by the people who were supposed to protect and raise him. Now, hearing all this, it's easy to feel some sympathy for the guy. After all, having a childhood like that, one as nightmarish as he had, is one that is very easy to make some people feel bad for him. And seeing as there's so many theories, art, and even fanfictions about Eddie, there's a large section of fans that think that way. That being said, no. As much as his backstory is horrific and straight up traumatizing, this does not give Eddie a pass. No matter what trauma he went through, no matter how much downplaying his actions people do, such to the extent of ignoring what he's done entirely, Eddie is still evil. All of what I just said is to explain why Eddie is the way he is, not to excuse it. Eddie still murdered those women. He still won't take responsibility. And at the end of the day, he is still a vile, disturbing, misogynistic serial killer. And that's not even getting into his role in the game itself. Eddie's first appearance can actually be seen early on in the Whistleblower DLC, right before Wayland himself is committed. Wayland had just finished sending an email to Miles that would clue him into Murkoff's doings, and he was called in to prepare the chamber for today's subject, Eddie Gluskin. Right before he's put into the chamber, Eddie broke free of the guards dragging him and pleaded to Wayland for help.
Help me! Don't let them do this! Don't let them... You! I know you can stop this! You have to help me.
It's a scene that's made even worse because if you were to listen closely before Eddie broke free, he says the guards are gonna rape him. And seeing as how he's been stripped down to his underwear and is being dragged off, it's easy to presume that this isn't just him screaming for help and screaming about the worst crime he can think of, but rather him being reminded about his traumatic past. Building off that, this is one of the closest we ever get to see Eddie losing grip on his coping mechanism and acknowledging that, yes, he was sexually abused as a child. And this is before we actually get to know who Eddie is and what his background is. Once inside the engine, Eddie's face starts to deform and break out in rashes. In a document, it's revealed that the reason for this is because the tubes often used were replaced with latex. This shows that not only is Gluskin allergic to latex, but the Murkoff Corporation is willing to go so far of the wall rider experiment that there's no level they'll go to in order to cause discomfort. From this point on, Eddie disappears as the story focuses on Waylon's escape, evading several inmates, Walker, and Monera and his crummy AI. That is until you reach the drying ground. Upon reaching the place, Waylon can find a document on the ground near a blocked door. The note itself isn't important, but what is important is that looking through the window, you can actually see Eddie walking by. He doesn't do much, he mostly just stares at you, but it does show that he's lurking around. And worst of all, he knows of your existence. Accompanying him is also the sound of a saw, and some players may think it's just Frank since his main weapon is a buzzsaw. Fortunately, it's not Frank, but unfortunately, it's something much worse. Entering the vocational block, Waylon is trapped in an attic with an inmate by the name of Dennis. Dennis has DID, or Dissociative Identity Disorder, a mental disorder that causes him to express multiple identities, or alters. Much of Dennis's dialogue is admittedly nonsense, just him talking to himself with his 4 alters. However, as Waylon progresses through the attic, Dennis starts to discuss someone known only as the Groom, and how they plan to give Waylon to him to avoid being a victim. At one point in the attic, you come across one of the few friendly inmates in the game, who warns you about the Groom.
Quiet! If they catch us, give us to him. The man downstairs. The man. Very bad. Very bad. God. Oh, God.
This immediately changes things up because there's now someone that even the other inmates are terrified of. If you play the base game, the only variant that the other inmates are confirmed to be afraid of is Chris Walker. But fortunately, their main salvation is that they have Father Martin to protect them. Here, there is no salvation. There's no hope for these inmates. Their only strategy is to either hope that the Groom doesn't find them, or that they can sacrifice someone else to him, like what Dennis plans to do to Waylon. Exiting the attic and heading down, we see the first of Eddie's macabre art, and no, I'm not showing it. I know I put a content warning on this, but this is genuinely one of the most disturbing scenes in an already very disturbing game. I would be executed by the YouTube firing squad if I showed this. However, just to give a very brief description, it's a mutilated male body that is stuffed and posed in a way to mimic childbirth. As Waylon tries to leave, he comes across a locked door, and to make matters worse...
Darling.
Eddie's here. He's the Groom. And he wants Waylon. As Waylon tries to avoid Eddie, Eddie seemingly recognizes Waylon, saying that he's seen his face before trying to woo him. He says that Waylon could make him whole, that they could start a family, constantly calling him darling. He feels like he just stepped out of a Clark Gable romance, or more specifically, the 50s. Evading Eddie, Waylon falls down an elevator shaft and injures his leg. And seeing how Waylon had run away from him, Eddie drops the charming personality and tries to kill Waylon by crushing him with the elevator. He fails of course, but now there's a new problem. Waylon's injured, and he can't run. Now, this is a huge shakeup to the game that I'm surprised not many fans actually point out. For as much as I do love the original Outlast, I'll admit that it's kinda easy to loop the enemies. Yes, your main objective is to get away from them, but you'll always be faster than them, you have constant choke points and barriers to move around them, you seem to have near infinite stamina. Unless you mess up somewhere and get yourself trapped in a corner, you'll never really be in much danger of getting caught. You can just parkour around the asylum like it's no one's business. Eddie, however, flips that by taking away your ability to run. Now looping Eddie, and for that matter, any other enemy you might encounter within the asylum becomes much more risky, and dare I say, near impossible to do. Eddie effectively has become the one character in every asymmetrical horror game that toxic survivor players demand to be nerfed, and in response, they get castrated. Something also interesting to note is the fact that this is one of the 2 times the player character limps in the game. Yes, you do limp in the base game too, but that's only at the end of the game, where the only thing left to do is open a door and get shot. However, this is the only time in the whole game where you're not only limping, but you're in legitimate danger. Horror games tend to be very different. They can have supernatural elements, they can have more grounded elements, you name it. However, what many of them have is the ability to run and hide. Running and hiding is considered a legitimate survival strategy in many of these games, and Outlast is no different. And like I mentioned earlier, running is easy. And in fact, I'd argue it's your most powerful tool to survive aside from the camera. Eddie, however, takes this away. He takes away one of your biggest survival tools, the ability to run, something that is a core aspect of any horror game. The worst part is that this doesn't go away. Outside of a brief section of the game, Waylon is left limping all the way to the end. Entering a room, Waylon finds himself at a dead end, and with Eddie approaching, Waylon hides in a locker. However, it turns out that it's a trap, and Eddie is able to quickly sniff him out and capture him. I need to take a moment to praise how well this sequence was executed. I know some people will call this a cheap way to get screwed, and yeah, I see the point, especially on second playthroughs when you realize that there is no way forward. However, I'd argue that everything works really well here. Since Waylon is just coming off being injured, you're already nervous because, oh shit, I'm much slower now. And now that you've gone down a path that looks like the correct way, only to find out it's a dead end, and with Eddie on the way, and you being unable to run, you're more than likely going to panic and go for your second defense in hiding. Throughout Outlast, there's all these lockers and desks that you can hide in or under, and they're instrumental in helping you out, especially if you're in a light area and can't exactly blend into the dark. This moment actively weaponizes this defense against you, and as such, that's another survival strategy that's been taken away from you. Okay, sure, you're not likely to be in a situation again where you have to hide from Eddie in a locker, since this segment is mostly chases. But from this point on, it feels like you can't trust hiding spots because, for all you know, they could be traps. As Eddie takes Waylon back to his workshop, Eddie apologizes for his vulgarity, blaming it on wanting to know a woman before expressing his desire to make an honest woman out of Waylon. He also says that he desires to be the father that he never had, and that he never let anything happen to his children. He then trails off a bit, but this is the second time, outside when we first meet him, that his coping mechanism slips and he acknowledges that what his father and uncle did were wrong. 12 hours later, Waylon wakes up to see Eddie mutilating other captive inmates and was one of the most gruesome scenes in the game. Once more, I'm not showing what he does, but to give a general summation, Eddie's making women out of these men by castrating them, and he's using some really sharp blades as well as a buzzsaw. Waylon himself nearly meets the same fate, but he winds up getting saved by another inmate. It's never known who this inmate actually is, but several fans have theorized that this inmate is the same one who warned Waylon about Eddie earlier. It's unknown on whether or not this inmate escaped Eddie as well, but seeing as how there isn't a body to be found, nor any screams to be heard, I personally think that the inmate did escape. Using the opportunity given to him, Waylon manages to escape by jumping out a window, and Eddie, from this point on, drops all the niceties.
Fine. Go! You and the rest of these ungrateful sluts!
Making his way back into the block and having to find a key to get out, Waylon encounters another horrific sight. The sight of several of Eddie's previous victims strung up and hung by the neck. Recording this sight, we can get a note that compares Eddie to Bluebeard, a serial killer who kills many of his wives. While this is mainly from Waylon's perception of Eddie, this note, especially the beginning of it, can be seen as a sign that Eddie's whole desire to want a family is nothing more than a delusion, even with him somewhat acknowledging his father's treatment of him. He just wants to kill women, and will go so far to do this that he'll forcefully make women out of the other male inmates to kill. He cannot be redeemed. He's already too far gone. Leaving the gymnasium, Eddie can be heard singing, and it's something alright. After getting through and finding said key in a ceremony, Eddie shows up, and the sole stealth segment with Eddie begins. And let me tell you, this is tense, and it's for a number of reasons. First off, hiding is much more of an uncertainty because now you're not sure whether or not Eddie can sniff you out easily. After all, he did it once, he could do it again. Second, you can't run. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, Eddie's just walking after you. It's not like he's that much of a threat, except that he still very much is. Unlike other variants who you can run faster than and get just enough distance to get a brief glimpse of before running away again, Waylon while injured is just barely faster than Eddie, even while you're trying to sprint. I found the hard way that Waylon is so slow that looking behind you will reveal that Eddie's within smelling distance of him. You literally have to hope and pray that if he sees you, he doesn't get close enough to hit you. There's one other thing I forgot to mention, and it's another gameplay mechanic that Eddie affects. One of the signatures of the game is the usage of a camera. For story purposes, this camera is used to document and record all the horrors the protagonist sees, but the camera actually serves a more practical purpose on top of that thanks to its night vision feature. This is essentially your flashlight, and one you have to keep a close eye on because using the night vision drains the battery even quicker. Thankfully, this entire place is filled with AA batteries which just so happen to fit your camera, so you'll never be at risk of running out. Except for Eddie, because what he does is not only drain the camera battery entirely, but you also lose all the batteries you've collected up to this point. That means when you first escape, you are fumbling around in the dark trying to avoid Eddie. Sure, you'll likely find another battery quickly and get your night vision back, but that is another thing that Eddie has taken away from you. He has messed with all 3 of your defenses, and he winds up being the only character in the game that does this. Eventually, Eddie's able to get his hands on Waylon once more and tries to string him up, but due to Waylon's weight and his struggling, the ceiling of the pulley system breaks, causing Eddie to be pulled up and impaled.
We could have been beautiful.
So that was Eddie Gluskin, bar none the most frightening character in the game in my opinion, despite his total screen time adding up to around 8 minutes of DLC you could complete in around half an hour. He's a character who is stuck in the minds of everyone, not just for first time players, but also for veteran players as well. He's become one of the most recognizable faces in the entire franchise, even to the extent that, alongside Chris Walker, the actual face of the franchise, he's even appeared in Outlast trials as a profile icon. This is a character who, again, is only on screen for about 8 or so minutes in a section that could be completed in about 15 minutes, meaning he only appears for a little over half the section, but he's still remembered to this day. So, why is that? Well, for starters, just what he does. While many of the other inmates and variants do pretty nightmarish stuff, Eddie takes it to a whole nother level. Walker? He just rips your head off. Trager? He just cuts pieces off you. Eddie? Yeah, he also cuts pieces off you, but what his plans are and the way he does it is so nightmarish that it sticks with you far beyond every other character in the game. Then there's his background, which, while I did say it doesn't excuse his actions, is still tragic in of itself. Not just for what happened to him, but also for what it took away from the world. For all the horrific actions he's done and disgusting rhetoric he's spewed, Eddie is undeniably talented. The various sketches of wedding dresses you can find indicate his background in fashion or art at the very least. He has a really solid looking waistcoat, which is much different from most of what the other inmates wear, so it's possible he made his outfit from stitched together uniforms. Not only that, while it is chilling while you're trying to outrun him, Eddie has a clear and smooth singing voice, one that I imagine would be quite pleasant to listen to under better circumstances. Eddie is a legitimately talented man, and for as much as I think the people who downplay his actions don't understand the character, it's easy to imagine that if he were raised better or saved earlier, he wouldn't have turned out this way. This natural ability would have made him successful in various ways, but instead, it's all gone to waste, becoming the facets of a ruined man beyond the point of salvation long before Murkoff got their hands on him. It's a tragic reality that even some of the most deranged people in the world could have these talents that will unfortunately never be put to good use. Speaking of which, another reason as to why Eddie is such a chilling character is because he's honestly the one I find the most grounded in reality. I feel like every major variant has some level of fantastical or exaggerated element to them. Chris Walker and his superhuman strength, and the Wall Rider and his everything, they do fall under the fantastical side. And while characters like Trager and Monero are a bit less so, their actions aren't stuff you hear about every day. I mean, when's the last time you heard about a cannibal or a mad doctor? Granted, Eddie's also a bit on the exaggerated side, with all the forced sex changes and stringing bodies from the ceiling, but I'm certain that everyone's heard of at least one news story of a man taking rejection, mainly from a woman, quite poorly, and then going on to stalk, harass, and in some cases, go as far as to assault or murder them. In the game itself, Eddie starts by trying to love bomb Waylon, then demeaning him the moment he rejects his advances. It's a very real thing that happens, regardless of the gender of the victim. And finally, and what I consider to be the biggest reason as to why Eddie is such a memorable and iconic character, is that he's someone who constantly takes away from you. I already talked about how his segment messes with your running, your hiding, your camera, but there is one thing that I haven't mentioned that I'm certain no one really thinks about. He takes away your security. Circling back to the realism of Eddie, I mentioned that Eddie's personality is something that is unfortunately very real. A deranged psychopath who takes rejection poorly and will do several uncomfortable actions that gradually get more and more severe. However, what makes Eddie unique is that he's one of the few villains in gaming that targets men this way. I know this sounds like a massive conjecture, but Outlast fans are very likely predominantly male. There's absolutely girls out there who have played the game, but from my experience, 9 times out of 10 I encounter a fan of the series, it's a guy. Now I bring this up because Eddie's actions and themes are able to take away securities whether you are a male or a female. For women, there's the misogyny and stalker anxiety that many deal with. For men, it's the disempowerment and feeling of helplessness, on top of Eddie threatening to castrate you and him getting very close to that. In a single character, both notes of pure carnal discomfort are hit in quick succession. And that's why Eddie is such a chilling character. The reason why I want to talk about Eddie and deviate from my usual content is because of how effective he is as a character. He's someone who, even when the franchise slips from my mind, is the first name I think of, and it's because he does so many things that make him memorable. Eddie Gluskin is a very complicated figure to talk about, but he's also no less chilling. He is a tragic figure, one that was put through such a nightmarish hell at an early age, having been chewed up and spat out by everyone who was supposed to protect and raise him, and morphed into a monster long before Murkoff got him. He's also a horrific character past the point of redemption, subjecting the player to some of the most visceral and uncomfortable moments in the entire game. He's a character who, in his very brief section, takes away all the comforts and securities the player has, something that no other character in the game does. Most importantly, however, he is a character that is all too real. He is someone who will hate being rejected. He is someone who will take that rejection personally. He is someone who had been hurt in the past, and all he wants to do now is hurt others. There are people like that out there, and that knowledge makes Eddie such a terrifying character. And that's it for me. If you like this video and want to see more, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. EternalOpossum out.